What advice do you give to working parents or soon to be working parents?
Yeah, soon to be working parents. So I think, I mean, obviously there's an awful lot I could talk about here, but I think the big thing is think ahead. So for a lot of people, when they're having a baby, especially or child, adopting a child, whatever, they're having a child in their family for the first time. It's a very overwhelming thing, right? It's a very big thing in your personal life. It's probably one of the biggest things that happens to you in your life, full stop. They don't think about that. So somebody goes off on leave, you might get a message saying, I've had the baby, and that's it. And then nothing. I remember my email being switched off and I was wondering if I'd been fired. I was like, what's happening? Like, why have I got no email?
Katherine, thank you so much for coming on the show. It means a lot to have you here. You're about to launch a book, or you did launch a book in June called Working Parents to Be.
I did.
Um, Tell us about it.
So it's called Working Parents to Be. Launched in June. It's basically a one step-by-step guide to parental leave and return. The reason I wrote it is essentially there are a lot of firms, or increasing numbers of firms out there, who offer support to individuals and hire people like me to come in and help people pre, during, and post parental leave. So when they're going away for a period of leave to have their child, to help them manage that transition to becoming a working parent. But there are obviously an awful lot of people out there who work for organisations who don't yet offer that kind of support. So for me, it was very much, it didn't feel very fair that there were a lot of people out there not getting this and not even realising that this stuff existed, and that it could make such a difference to them. So that's why I wrote the book.
How do you think we're doing as a culture, as a society, particularly in the West, on this particular issue?
I think it varies enormously, actually. We're getting better. It's definitely improving all the time. So, I mean, I've been working in this space now for about 12 years. And that's sort of going back to the time I had my daughter. And when I started, I actually thought, when I originally had an idea to set up a parent network, I thought it was my idea. I thought I'd come up with this brilliant idea. And then very quickly realized that there were networks out there for parents and other groups. But the business I work for, so I work for Sky, which is a big broadcaster, TV broadcaster in the UK, and across Europe, and they just didn't do it. But there were some other big organisations that did. So at that point, it was mostly the sort of big financial institutions, big legal firms, so professional services, those kind of firms, who I think my theory is basically they have very high value employees, cost a lot to recruit, and they were competing to recruit that talent. So that's where it started. How else can we retain this talent? How else can we be different? And then it moved down to the likes of Sky, who have they're very big firms, but they have very different employee types. So not just the corporate kind of people, which was my day job, studio staff, engineers, retail staff, contact center, all that kind of thing. And then it's sort of moved down since then. So some of my clients today are quite small businesses. And that's a real step change. It's a real shift. And it's also changed in terms of who people are supporting. So it went from very much supporting parents, and particularly mums to start with, to now it's about dads as well. It's about managers as well, because it's all very well equipping a parent, but if you haven't equipped a manager in how to have those conversations as well, then you're only dealing with half of it, right?
Right. Yes. Yes. That is perfectly said. What is your story? What led you down this road and led you to writing this book? I get like you noticed the problem, but like, what's your personal attachment to this?
Yep. So my story. So basically, I worked in mostly, but not exclusively, corporates for about 20 years until I started doing this. So back in 2011, I had my daughter, and at that point, I was in a strategy role at Sky. So my day job involved working with our exec and their direct reports on big change projects. So things like when we launched Sky Mobile, which is a cell phone business in the UK, should we do it? And if we do it, what people would we need? What processes? What would the model look like for that? And that kind of thing. But as I say, I went on maternity leave myself while I was in that role, came back. And whilst I had an incredibly supportive team, none of the people that I worked with at that stage had young children. So none of them knew what it was like to juggle this kind of big day job with a small child. And I really miss the kind of people I'd met when I'd been on leave through antenatal classes and that, who are basically going through the same experience and having that shared experience. So I found myself really wanting to have that, but with others who knew what it was like to work at Sky, because every business has got its own culture, its own way of doing things, and I really wanted that connection. So that's where it started from. It literally was a moment, as I was sort of saying, in the mirror one morning, going, I've got this idea, I can just create this network. That's what I need. I need a network for the people here. and then realizing that other organizations did it, just not Sky. So I then used those other organizations, used my own network to find people, find out what they were doing, what was working, what wasn't, to put together a bit of a pitch internally to say, look, why are we not doing this? Other people are starting to do this. This is, there's no downside here. We should be doing this. But fast forward a little bit. So by the time I left Sky, I had 1,600 members of staff signed up. I had 2 exec sponsors, a team of volunteers, and we ran everything from an online forum to connecting those different employee types, to coffee mornings, to bringing in expert speakers, to doing sessions pre, during, and post parental leave. And it was those sessions that gave me the biggest sense of satisfaction at seeing that you can, just by pulling people together and talking them through, that A, you're not alone in these fears and these challenges that you're facing, and B, there's something you can do about it. There are things you can do about it. So we made a decision to leave London as a family back in 2016, and I'd at that stage been trying to decide what to do with my day job. I loved what I did, but I didn't love it as much as I loved this. So I decided to do just that, to set up on my own. So that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years. So as I say, I now work with businesses from small startups all the way through to globally listed companies, and predominantly help them in a couple of areas. So I predominantly help them support their working parents. Those run sessions, either one-to-one or in groups if they're big enough and that works for them, to help them during that transition, to help their employees go through that transition. And also help their managers. So I regularly run sort of workshop style sessions, because again, it's better for the managers to be able to talk through these challenges. And again, see, they're not the only one terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing, that, everybody's feeling the same, and hey, there's some things you can do. And then the second area I do a lot of work on is gender balance. So the other thing I did while I was at Sky was co-found our Women in Leadership initiative to get more of our women into senior roles. So those are my kind of 2 real passions, and they obviously overlap quite a lot. So I do quite a lot of sort of project work for businesses. But for me, the book, as I say, was very much back to when I first started at Sky in this area, being that there was only big businesses doing this, and being frustrated that why were not more business, why weren't there more? Why was there not more support? And how could I get this message out there? And feeling that I think as an individual, there's only so many clients I could take on. I'm never, ever going to get to all these people. So how could I do that? Why not write a book? And I looked and I couldn't believe there wasn't one out there. In fact, the publisher, when I spoke to them, they were like, I can't believe this doesn't exist. I can't believe. And if you can tell me there is one, that's great. But I haven't been able to find another book that does this and takes people through this yet. Anyway.
Have you been, because it's an Amazon bestseller, like it has been, and the response has been incredible. Have you been surprised by the response? Did you expect this type of response? How are you feeling now, a few months after it being published?
That's a lovely question, actually. I think I hoped for this kind of response, because for me the need is obvious, that it's there, but I wasn't sure, right? And actually, it's been brilliant. It's been brilliant to see that. And I think the one challenge I really have got, and it's obviously part of the reason I wrote the book, is that there's support, there's things that can make a difference, but people don't know it exists. So, and that is a double-edged sword, right? Because if they don't know it exists, they don't necessarily go looking for it. You don't know what you don't know. So for me, a big part of the launch has been trying to get the message out that it is this. And there are small things you can do. So whether it's buying the book, or whether it's through listening to a podcast or something else and hearing it and the articles and everything else. But for me, the most important thing is helping these people and getting it out there.
Yeah, that sounds right. And what advice, there's a lot of people who watch the show, listen to the show, that type of stuff, are leaders, they're CEOs, they lead companies, small, big, medium, large, all that type of stuff. What advice would you have for them, particularly around helping working parents? Let's start with that one.
There's an awful lot you can do. And I think if somebody's out there and they haven't really got much of an idea, in fact, I spoke to the CEO of quite a big US firm last week, and he was like, I don't actually even know what we're doing in this area right now. It's not necessarily on their radar, right? Immediately, day to day, but they're conscious of it. You see a lot in the news. They're aware it's a growing issue. And actually, even the number of people who are parents who are working is going up the whole time. The stats show that, there's more and more of us, and more parents are both working full time. And so it's a growing demographic in terms of your employees. So, but from a business point of view, I think the first thing you can do is, there's some easy stuff, is to say, look, right, where are we now, right? What do we provide? What do our people think? So talk to your people, and ask them. You could do this very easily with your HR teams or people teams, is get them to just go and do a little focus group and say, right, what's your experience been like? What's been really good? What's been not so good? Where do we do well? Where don't we? What could we change? And that would include everything from their managers being up to speed and helping them and supportive to what provisions they make in terms of maternity and paternity and all that kind of thing. So that's definitely the first thing to do. And then check your numbers. Are you keeping people through this journey? When they become parents, do they come back? Or are you losing them to the competition? Are they going elsewhere? So sort of understanding what your numbers are and your breakdown of your employees is definitely something else to think about. And then I think there's some harder stuff. So it then sort of moves or goes up. But once you've done that and you've got that basis of knowledge, if you like, that data points that you can look at, because to me, you can probably tell this from my background in the strategy, big projects, to me, there's a logical way to attack all of this stuff. And it's exactly the same as you would ever do any other business. You wouldn't launch a product without researching your market and getting your numbers together or anything else. So why would you do anything different with this? So for me, it's exactly the same. You get your data, and then you have a look and say, right, okay, what can we do with this? What would our program of change might look like? So, and that includes training your managers. It includes having sessions potentially pre, during, post leave. Now, obviously, what I would say to people is if that's a step too far, and actually interesting, a lot of the conversations I'm having is with businesses who don't yet provide support, and they're gifting the book as a start. Yeah, it's a great start. It's a really nice way to say we care, we get it, we're trying to do something. Here's a really quick, easy way of going, right, here's a start of a 10. And actually, another thing that didn't occur to me, probably should have done, it's quite obvious. A lot of people are buying a few copies just to have around the office so that somebody can pick it up and put it down when it's useful for them, particularly managers, right? Because sometimes I'll do training sessions for people. And if they're not a manager of somebody immediately going off on leave, then they might forget. Right. And some of the stuff, with the best will in the world, even if I run hopefully the most amazing training session or workshop, they still might forget it when it's really relevant. So having something to look back to and thumb through is obviously a really helpful thing.
Now, let's do the reverse of that. What advice do you give to working parents
So for
or soon to be working parents?
Yeah, soon to be working parents. So I think, obviously there's an awful lot I could talk about here, but I think the big thing is think ahead. So for a lot of people, when they're having a baby, especially or child, adopting a child, whatever, they're having a child in their family for the first time. It's a very overwhelming thing, right? It's a very big thing in your personal life. It's probably one of the biggest things that happens to you in your life, full stop. And so you're just so focused on that. I know I was. All I could think about is I'm having a baby. Oh my God, I'm having a baby. Like, what does that mean? What have I got to buy? What have I got to prepare for? Work, I knew I wanted to go back to work, but for me, work is tomorrow's problem, right? You're not remotely worried about that right now. That can wait. So actually what I say to people, and a lot of the reason for the sessions is to help them bring that forward and say, right, let's just have a look, because there's a lot of stuff probably in the back of your mind that's niggling and you're worried about and you're concerned about and you're pushing it away. But actually, if you just spend a little bit of time thinking about that right now, there's some stuff you could do right now, even before you go on leave, that's going to make a really big difference to your experience, both while you're off on leave and then when you're coming back into the business. Things like, for example, thinking about what contact you might want when you're on leave. So if you don't talk to your employer about this, most law, and obviously it varies a little bit around the world, but most laws protect people when they're on parental leave. So most employers are so busy, and individuals so busy with their handover and their projects and like getting all that sorted and maybe bringing somebody in to cover the role or divvying it up or however they're going to do it. They don't think about that. So somebody goes off on leave, you might get a message saying I've had the baby, and that's it. And then nothing. I remember my email being switched off and I was wondering if I'd been fired. I was like, what's happening? Like, why have I got no email? And it was because the company policy was leave her alone. She's on leave. That's it. Off she goes. So if you don't have those kind of conversations and say, actually, to start with, I'm probably going to be really knee deep in it. I don't really want anything other than social contact. But actually, after I've been away a couple of months, I really want to know how that project turned out that I was working on. And I'd really love to know, obviously any big changes in the business. And then when I'm looking forward to coming back, actually I'd like to come in and do some days. So we have something in the UK, which I know doesn't exist in the US as yet, called KIT days, keeping in touch days. And you can basically be paid for some days while you're off on leave. And the idea is to help you reconnect. So to help you, start building. So you might talk about that and what you're going to do with that. So there's all sorts of things you can do beforehand that really will make a material difference while you're off or when you're coming back.
How do you think AI affects everything that you're talking about here? Does it affect it at all? Does it mean like, hey, we may not even have big companies anymore? Like, how are you thinking about that currently?
I think there's obviously a lot of AI can be really helpful in terms of looking things up and finding information and going through it. But I don't think for me, in terms of what I do, there's no direct substitute for that kind of conversation part. And actually that the workshops I talk about, so where you have big firms that run sessions, the really big thing that obviously I'm just facilitating it at that point. You've got people, again, you're building a network between individuals, which obviously is going to help them collaborate, help them, help them in their day jobs massively, help them have those connections, which you just can't, you just sort of can't get through that. But in terms of material, I mean, for me, I used it in just to find, here's a media list, here's a list of people I should be talking to, like really quickly, really easily. There's some really nice things that will, help you. But I don't think, the personal connection side and the sort of fears side, and that, I don't think it can constitute.
What does a typical day look like for you? You sound like you have a very interesting job, and every day might be a little bit different.
Every day really is different. It starts and ends the same, because I have a daughter who is now 13. So just to give you an idea of time. So my day would start with getting her up and, out the door for her school bus. And I try really hard not to look at my email before that, because she goes pretty early. So, hopefully everything can wait till 7:30 in the morning. I then typically take the dog for a walk on the beach. We're lucky we live near the beach. So I love that as a way to clear my head. And I'm a big believer, because a lot of what I do is remote at the moment anyway, so still post-pandemic. And because I work with people all over the world, it's, it's obviously the way it works. But for me, getting out and getting some fresh air and that at the start of the day is massively important, and having that sort of social connection. So that's how I start. But then the rest of the days are a mix between one-to-one sessions with people, group workshops, group sessions, and then project work. So what I didn't really talk about very much, but the gender balance work that I do tends to be much more project based. So things like helping businesses understand why they're not getting more women into senior roles. And so I often do projects. So for example, doing a survey with all their employees, then interviews, and then pulling that all together. So some of it's data analysis, some of it's interviews for research, and then presenting that back to leadership teams. So it really is a massive sort of mix, which is great, because that's what I love. I really enjoy that variety.
Having worked with so many leaders, what do you think makes a great leader, and what do you think makes an average or even mediocre or bad leader? Like, having seen, I imagine, like, hey, if they're bringing you on, they probably are a pretty good leader, like thinking, forward and ahead on like how this would, affect their employee base, all that type of stuff. But you've worked with a lot of leaders. Tell
Yeah.
us, like, what's the best kind of
Yeah.
leadership traits that people should look for or try to develop?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best leaders I've come across are empathetic, and they get what's going through their people's minds, and they inspire people. So I think those are the two biggest things I see, that I think, because if you really if you can see somebody and what they're trying to do, and they involve you in it, and you're going towards a common purpose, that can be really inspirational, right? And you get people to follow without having to tell them to do that. And then the empathy side. So I've got a story that's just come to my mind. I'll share if you don't mind, but just to sort of elaborate on that. So I remember back in my early days of working the strategy team at Sky, and it was the first time I was asked to do a piece of work on an operating model for a business. And I remember thinking, well, why are they asking me? I haven't done this before. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. So this is like 15 years ago or something. And I remember our strategy director at the time, and she could see instantly what was going on in my mind, what I was worried about. And she just said, look, right, I know exactly where you're going with this. You're smart. You'll ask the right questions. You will become our expert. We trust you. Just go and ask the questions that you think need to be asked. And it was massively empowering for me. And it was a massive moment for me, I guess, in my own journey, just to learn to trust yourself a little bit more. But the fact that she was able to do that was very, very was inspirational for me, I guess, but it made a huge difference for me. And I think on the flip side of that, where I've had experiences with not so good leaders, is when they really don't get their people, and they don't get the motivations, and they don't get their fears or their concerns, and they're not quick to sort of plug into that and understand that and help pull people together.
Another thing that I think would be interesting to hear from you on is just the differences between the United States and the United Kingdom, if there are any, in like leadership, in like issues like this. You've already talked about one, like the KIT program, like
Yeah.
the keep in touch, that type of stuff. What have you noticed, like, that one does really well, one doesn't, and vice versa?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in the UK, we're definitely further ahead with the parental leave and the gender balance side of it, in terms of programs and those kind of initiatives that are taking place. But we're not exclusively the best in that. And actually, one of the most interesting things with the book was doing that research around what else exists across the world. What is different, and there are pockets of best practice, as you would expect everywhere, just in the same way as there is with leadership, etc. But you'll see, for example, in China, in India, in Spain, they have paid nursing breaks. We don't have that in the UK. In the Nordic countries, they're famous for having longer, periods of paid leave for people. In the UK, we have a long period of leave, but you only actually benefit from that if you get paid for it. So again, it's almost like a two-tier system. If you work for a really big firm or a really progressive firm, then you'll get 6 months of pay or more. And sometimes that's now increasingly that's now for fathers as well as for mothers. So you've got this growing kind of base of really good support, but then there's a lot of people still working and getting the bare minimum. And I think what I'm seeing is the same in the States. Now, obviously, in the States, it's complicated because you've not only got the federal system, but you've also got states. So state by state, you get different provisions, right? And I remember I've got a friend who's in Nevada, and I remember him. He was on his recently on his second leave for his second child, and him saying you have to take disability leave here. Like it's not even recognised. So there's some massive variations in what's provided. There's good and bad in both places, I think is probably fair to say on that front. But yeah, the UK tends to be further ahead. In wider leadership, I think it's interesting. I think the big difference, and I'm probably going to say this because of the area that I work in, right? But it's the employment law side of it that is very, very different. And again, I've got a very close friend who lives in Colorado, for example, and so I'm quite familiar in a personal level from the differences when you change jobs and notice periods that seem to be tight. You finish a job on Friday, you start a new one on Monday. That just would never happen here. The whole hand, everything is probably too elongated over here, and I think some of Europe's even worse. But there's got to be something right in the middle. To be able to switch that quickly doesn't seem to be in anybody's interest. So it's interesting. It's a lot more cutthroat, I think, in some respects. Even if you're used to working for quite commercial organizations, the people element is different, very different.
Are you surprised in the United States? This is a very political topic, this whole idea around diversity, DEI, that type of stuff. And you're not exactly doing, that type of work, but in some ways, obviously you are, right? Particularly in the inclusion and thinking about diversity, that type of stuff. Are you surprised? And by the way, I don't know if it's political in the UK, but it is here in the United States where I am. And so are you surprised by that? And what has your reaction been to that? And have you been asked to kind of speak out on behalf of, these issues publicly, outside of, because how CEOs are now being asked to speak on things that are well beyond what they do at their company. I wonder if you've experienced that and kind of how you are viewing this conversation and kind of the overall ecosystem.
I think it's a really interesting question, actually. And actually what you said to start with is also really interesting, because I got this feedback when I wrote the book from friends over in the US, even about the term diversity is used differently. So you think it's a common term, but it's not. They came back to me saying, you call yourself a diversity and inclusion advisor. People in the US think that means ethnicity. Right, it's okay, that's really interesting, because here it means the whole breadth. Now, I call myself a diversity and inclusion advisor who specializes in working parents and women, and gender balance, because to me those are the two elements that are obviously personal to me and my experience and my expertise and everything else. But there's obviously a wide range, social status, everything else. Age is becoming much bigger here, all sorts of other pieces. So it's much more, my sense is, and you tell me if you think that's different, but my sense is it's just different focus areas. We look at it as a lot more different things pulled together under an umbrella, if you like. To your point on the politicization of it all, I think that's really interesting that how that's happened, and it's definitely happening here as well. And firms are very quickly in trouble, if you like, if they don't react to big major events and at least acknowledge. But I think for me, where that comes and it becomes really important is just to put messaging out there to say, we know this is happening. We understand it might be affecting you. It might be affecting your colleagues. Gaza is a very recent example here. There was a lot more activity I've seen amongst companies I work with, and that around making sure that something was said and something was done to sort of recognise the tensions that people might be facing in the workplace, and the fears that some people might have depending on what community they're from, their religion, etc. And obviously for a lot of Jewish people, it's not necessarily obvious that they're Jewish when they're working. It's not something that's it's easier This might sound funny. Certain religions are obviously easier to recognize immediately that that's what somebody is, especially if they're doing, they've got prayers or they've got this or that. Whereas if, some religions, you'd never know, right? You'd never know talking to somebody, even in a conversation like this, you wouldn't necessarily know what my religion was, or you don't necessarily, it's not as visible. So I think that's been very interesting, but it's definitely become, I think, a requirement. But I think it's more on a human level that it's important to recognize this stuff, and just to say, we get that this is an external pressure that is going to be impacting you as individuals, and as a business we get that, and we want to try and support you with that, versus it's right, wrong, or otherwise, depending on what it is.
Do you think this is relatively new? Like, it's really interesting that CEOs of, leaders of companies, say you have like a manufacturing company or, a consumer app or something like that, and the media or whoever in the world is asking you, hey, can you give us your take on Israel, Gaza, and how things are going, and like put out a public statement on that? That is like, what do you think? One, I wonder, like, what do you think of that?
Yeah.
And two, I wonder, what advice do you have for leaders who are probably experiencing this for the first time, since this is a relatively new phenomena of leaders of companies and CEOs speaking out on these types of issues?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's the first generation, if you like, of leaders that have had to do this and have been expected to do this, and they're bound to make mistakes, right? And they're bound to, I think it's almost inevitable. It's a bit like I'll get asked often, like, well, we don't want to do anything on diversity and inclusion, or on our gender, for example, because until we know exactly what we're doing, and so they hold back. And my advice has always been, don't hold back. Explain it's a journey, and you're going to make mistakes as you go. And I think, to me, the parallels are with this. It's not, I don't think a leader should be expected to have a really strong view on something that's very political, that's nothing to do with their business, because why should they, right? That's not their expertise. That's not what they should be doing. However, they can absolutely recognize it's happening, and it is affecting lots of, as I was saying before, affecting lots of people, and a lot of their employees might be very affected by it, and recognizing what does impact their world, and how that it might impact, if they're a global supplier and they've got global, clients and customers and employees and everything else. So it's more, I think it should be to stand up when something happens straight away, and be noted for saying something. Sometimes it's like that old thing, saying nothing is worse than saying the wrong thing, right? But saying something altogether, but just making sure it's human. It's a human response, and it takes into account what their people might be feeling first and foremost. And by their people, I don't just mean the people that work for them, but the people that their business interacts with on a regular basis. So their clients and their suppliers and everybody who's in their world.
Finally, by the way, what an honor to talk to you, and congratulations on the book and everything that you've accomplished. It's really, and starting this conversation and leading this conversation, so incredible. We end every interview with the same question, and that is, we believe the chances one gives are just as important as the chances one takes. When you hear that, who gave you a chance to get you to where you are today?
I think it was probably one of our exec when I was at Sky. So another one. I know I talked about somebody earlier, a different one. And I got to the point with trying to build the parent network. And I'd got as far as I could effectively on my own, very little help. And it was one of those moments where I was like, oh, I could ask, but I don't really know this person. It was one of the exec I hadn't worked with very much before, so I didn't have a strong personal relationship with them. But I knew, because they ran our TV studios, that they would be able to help me with what I was trying to do, which was get a pilot filmed. And so in the end, it was one of those, I've got nothing to lose. I'll just ask, And so I did, and they came back and answered within 20 minutes. I had a meeting with them within a couple of days. And they were so blown away with what I was doing. And like, you're doing this on the side of your day job with a young child, and you're trying to make a difference. Right. Okay. This is brilliant. Yeah. What do you need? Yeah, I'll support it. And I'm going to do one better than that. I'm going to get onto our CEO, Jeremy. I'm going to get you in with him, because we need to do more of this. And it was so heartening, I guess, for me, that it was a frightening thing to do, because it was outside of my day job. It wasn't my remit. It wasn't me going to them and saying, right, I'm working on this project, I need your help with X, Y, Z. It was a very personal passion and a very personal thing that I thought I could make a difference to our people. And her believing in me and sort of opening that door, and not just opening it, but then pushing other doors open, really made a difference. And obviously it's led me to not only not give up at that point, because I was almost at the point of giving up, it not only allowed me to keep going and to make it work there, but obviously it's led on to what I now do as a job. If I'd never known that 10 years or whatever it was ago, that question would have led me to where I am now, and then writing the book. I must get in touch with her, actually. You remind me. So thanks again.
That's incredible. That's so great. Katherine, thank you so much for coming on. Seriously, what an honor to talk to you.
You're very welcome. It was really lovely to be here. Thank you so much.